Okay, then we continue with the topic of culture exchange in a way, in a different way. The period of 250 BC, the Mauryan period in India, I think is one of the most inspiring periods in Buddhist history. And so it's inspiring in different ways, in terms of the growth of the teaching of the Buddha in society. The teaching of the Buddha expanded from being a local Indian religion to being a world religion that existed in many countries, in different cultures. And also the growth of the Sangha itself was inspiring. The growth of the monastic community, and also a great number of people actually practicing the Dhamma and realizing the Dhamma. In a way, one can say that this period was initiated by the Buddha himself, by his own foresight, and because the Buddha was teaching different ideals to different people, depending on their abilities or faculties. And so, for example, the monks and nuns, he encourages to become like Venerable Sariputta, Venerable Moggallana, or Sister Khema and Sister Upalavana. So to take them as example and emulate them. Then for his lay disciples, he encourages them to take advanced lay practitioners as example, who are non-returners. But then the Buddha also sometimes talks about another ideal, the wheel-turning emperor, the Cakkavatti. And so this was already a mythology in India that existed at that time, I think. And so the Buddha more or less gave it this meaning that a king or ruler rules by the power of the Dhamma, by his virtue and his noble qualities for the welfare of his people. And he provides safety and protection in his realm, so works for the welfare of his people and looks after them like a father cares for his children. And the Buddha obviously was hoping that some kings or rulers in the future, or at his time, would emulate this ideal of a wheel-turning emperor. So about 200 years after the Buddha, at the time a cruel and ambitious king established an empire which encompassed almost entire India. He did it by warfare. But then later he became a disciple of the Buddha and was inspired to practice or follow this example of a wheel-turning emperor. And this king was King Ashoka. Then so because he also left behind various edicts carved in stone, other rock edicts or pillar edicts, then we can still hear more or less his voice over 2,300 years. And so here's just a short example where he talks himself about his last war and then his inner change. Then he's referring to himself in this edict by his coronation name, King Piyadasi, also beloved of the Devas. So, and he says, King Piyadasi conquered the Kalingas, a kingdom in the south of India, 8 years after his coronation. 150,000 people were deported, and 100,000 were killed, and many more died from other causes. After the Kalingas had been conquered, King Piyadasi came to feel a strong inclination towards the Dhamma, a love for the Dhamma and for instruction in the Dhamma. Now King Piyadasi feels deep remorse for having conquered the Kalingas. Indeed, King Piyadasi is deeply pained by the killing, dying and deportation that takes place when an unconquered country is conquered. Therefore, the killing, death or deportation of 100th or even 1,000th part of those who died during the conquest of Kalinga now pains King Piyadasi. King Piyadasi thinks that even those who do wrong should be forgiven where forgiveness is possible. Truly, King Piyadasi desires the non-injury, restraint and impartiality to all beings, even where wrong has been done. I have had this Dhamma edict written so that my sons and great-grandsons may not consider making new conquests, or that if military conquests are made, that they are done with forbearance and light punishment, or still better, that they consider making conquests of the Dhamma only, for that leads to good results in this life and the next. May they be devoted to that which brings good results in this life and the next. Yes, I think that's a very rare thing that in human history that some king or ruler ever expresses his regret over a military conquest or the damage that he did during a war. So I'm not sure whether there are any other examples of something like this. And so, last week I talked about non-violence, and yes, as king or president, one is often involved in sort of unwholesome things. And once you're in position of power, then the tendency is that your main objective becomes to remain in power. And if this becomes your main objective, then naturally, then you tend to do actually bad things. The other thing is also that others will be competing with you for power. Obviously, in a position of power, then others also want power and influence. They will try to influence you, or actually just more or less take over from you. And so naturally, then it is a position where you is more prone to get into trouble. But on the other hand, then one could also do various good things for people, obviously, in a position of power. And so the Buddha says in one discourse that a king or a ruler sets an example for the rest of the population, either for the better or the worse. And so, today at least one inspiring example of a king who changed his ways and became non-violent. King Ashoka was tolerant to all religions in his kingdom. He even also made donations to other religions or encouraged that religions sort of respect each other. He mentions this also in his edicts. But he himself became a follower of Buddhism and worked to support it in various ways. He distributed the relics of the first Buddhist stupas into many stupas that he built in his entire kingdom. He had large stone pillars erected to mark important Buddhist holy sites for future millennia. And in several cases, they were also crucial for identifying these holy sites again in the last century. In Bodhgaya, he had a large decorated stone slab erected to mark the place where the Buddha attained awakening, the Vajirasana, which is the center of the temple of the most important Buddhist holy site in the world up to the present. And probably King Ashoka also built the first temple in Bodhgaya, then in 250 BC. King Ashoka also expresses his concern for the unity of the Sangha in several of his rock and pillar edicts. And also he expresses his faith in the Triple Gem and his aspiration that the teaching of the Buddha may last a long time. And he's even quoting some discourses and recommending them to learn them. So you can even find some edicts where he mentions specific discourses that you can still find in the Sutta Pitaka 2,300 years later. And also he was the patron of the Third Buddhist Council. So he built a large hall with 80 pillars outside of his capital, Pataliputta. This is today Patna in India. And so in this hall then the monks assembled for the council. As after the third Buddhist council, then King Ashoka and the leading senior monk of the council, Venerable Moggaliputta Tissa, they made a decision that led to one of the most important events in the history of Buddhism. They decided to send groups of Buddhist monks in distant countries so that many people can benefit from the teaching of the Buddha, also further away. The Buddha himself was also wandering in northern India for 9 months per year. So he only stayed at one place during the Vasa, during the monsoon, because traveling was not convenient. But the rest of the year he was then walking to different villages and towns and cities. And so during these 45 years, when the Buddha was teaching, he walked around in an area of about 300,000 square kilometers. It's an area about the size of Germany, just to give an approximate impression how big this area is. And they visited over 900 places. So cities, towns, villages, rivers, mountains, hills, forests. These are just the places which are mentioned in the suttas. But one can see that obviously the area of the size of Germany is already quite a big area. And some monks, already during the time of the Buddha, they decided to wander outside the Ganges Valley. But until the King Ashoka's time, then it never had reached beyond India. And so after King Ashoka expresses his regret about his previous wars, then he also more or less talks about his conquest of the Dhamma. What he means by that is that he, on the one hand, tries to encourage his citizens for good conduct or to practice punya, to practice good actions by body, speech and mind. And on the other hand, also sort of promoting the teaching of the Buddha in his kingdom and outside of his kingdom. And so he says, "Now it is the conquest of the Dhamma that King Piyadasi considers the best of conquests. And the conquest of the Dhamma has been won, here, on the borders, and even 6,000 kilometers away, where the Greek king Antiochus rules, beyond there where the 4 kings named Ptolemy, Antigonus, Magas and Alexander rule, which is Egypt, Greece, Turkey and the Middle East and Libya, and as far as Sri Lanka. Even where King Piyadasi's envoys have not been, these people do, too, having heard of the practice of the Dhamma and the ordinances and instructions in the Dhamma given by King Piyadasi, are following it and will continue to do so. This conquest has been won everywhere, and it gives great joy, the joy which only the conquest of the Dhamma can give." So a group of monks were sent to southern India, north to Nepal, eastwards to Thailand and Myanmar, and west to Gandhara, which is today Pakistan and Afghanistan, and then also to the Greek empires in the Middle East and Turkey. And at the time this was basically Greek empires, and then further also to Greece and Egypt. And also the most successful Dhamma-Missions of King Ashoka were the ones to Gandhara, where Buddhism existed for as a major religion for about 1,000 years. And then, of course, to Thailand, Burma and Sri Lanka. Why the Dhamma-Missions to Greece and Egypt were not more successful, I'm not sure. Whether the people were not more receptive or for what reason, but otherwise we would have some more stupas in Greece or Egypt from that time, obviously, or later times. And what is special about the mission of King Ashoka to Sri Lanka is also that he sent his own crown prince, Anand Mahinda, who became a Buddhist monk. And the Sri Lankans, they were more interested to write down the history than people of other countries. And so, because of that, we actually only have a report from the mission to Sri Lanka. And for Thailand and Myanmar, we only have the names of the leading monks. For example, in the Sri Lankan chronicles, they mention Son and Uttara, who went to Suvarnabhumi, which is probably Thailand and Myanmar, but these names were only preserved in the Sri Lankan chronicles. No, I never heard any stories about the arrival of Thailand, of Buddhism in Thailand and Myanmar, similar like in Sri Lanka, which was that detailed, where the names of the monks were mentioned. So, yeah. Yeah, so at that time, King Ashoka and the young new Sri Lankan king, King Devanampiyatissa, they had already been in some diplomatic contact with each other before, and then after King Devanampiyatissa' coronation, he sent some treasures as tribute, jewels to King Ashoka. Sri Lanka is also famous for jewels, like sapphires. I think to pronounce it sapphires. How do you pronounce sapphire? Sapphire? Okay, good. Yeah. Sapphires. Yeah, good. Yeah. So, and then in return, King Ashoka sends some royal insignia back to the King of Sri Lanka, and also Dhamma teachings, and he encourages him to delight in the supreme treasures, the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha, and take refuge in them as well. So from the story in the Mahavamsa, it seems that more or less the King Ashoka felt he has the authority to sort of approve the King of Sri Lanka as a king, even because he sends this royal insignia and says that he should more or less be crowned again as a king. So then several months after King Devanampiyatissa, the Sri Lankan king, receives these gifts and the message from King Ashoka, then Venerable Moggaliputta tells Venerable Mahinda that now it's the time to go to establish the teaching of the Buddha in Sri Lanka. And they go as a group of 5. The reason is that this is the minimum quorum for ordination. So outside of the Ganges Valley, for a valid ordination to take place, there have to be at least 5 monks. And so there are Mahinda, Itya, Uttiya, Sambala, and Padasala, and also one Samanera, Sumana. It was the son of Sanghamitta, one of the daughters of King Ashoka. He was already, at least in rare cases, during the time of the Buddha or later, some young people also became arahants. So one of the examples would be this Samanera Sumana. And during the time of the Buddha, similar, at least 1 or 2 cases are described. Yeah. For example, Dabbamalaputta, he was the foremost lodgings officer during the time of the Buddha, and he lived most of the time in Rajagaha, which was one of the larger places with several monasteries, and then he looked after the lodgings, and he was one of these people who became arahants at a young age already. And so then on the Uposatha of this month, of the current month, then Mahinda and the other monks, they travel to Sri Lanka, and they decide to more or less start at a mountain which is 11 kilometers away approximately from the capital Anuradhapura, the Misaka mountain. It's a scenic mountain with various caves and beautiful nature, and so they decide to meet the king of Sri Lanka there. They're landing on a rock spire on top of the mountain, and at that time the king of Sri Lanka was hunting there in the forest, trying to shoot a deer with bow and arrow. The deer is sort of running away from him, and he's following it. According to the Mahavamsa, it was a deva that tries to bring the king to the monks. So yeah, the king, who is sort of not really looking after himself, he's just separating from his entourage, and then he's encountering Venerable Mahinda on his own. Venerable Mahinda thinks that the king is too frightened if they show up there as a group of 7 people, and so he's hiding them with psychic powers, and to not to scare the king too much. Obviously, at that time, the king said to be afraid always to be led into an ambush or to be assassinated, and yeah, so then naturally, if suddenly a person shows up, then it can mean that someone is trying to assassinate you as king. Venerable Mahinda tries to put him at ease by calling him by his personal name. He says, "Come, Tissa." The Buddha also does that sometimes. For example, with Anathapindika. When Anathapindika comes to meet the Buddha, then he also calls him by his personal name, Sudatta. Anathapindika is sort of inspired and happy and thinks, he is calling me by his name, by my name, and he's sort of happy. But the king is still sort of frightened and thinks there must be some strange spirit or some kind of strange being that has appeared there. I think one can also imagine, let's say, if you go on alms round in some country where there have never been monks, then also if you show up like this, then people think, what kind of strange being you are, or sort of what are you doing, something like that. So it's actually not so not so unimaginable that he's sort of just scared or think this is something strange. So the calling him by his name was not really helpful in this case. He just thinks that because he knows his name already, even though he doesn't know who he is really. Then Venerable Mahinda tells him that they are disciples of the Buddha and monks, and they've come out of compassion from India to his country. And then, so King, the Sri Lankan king then remembers King Ashoka's message, and then finally calms down and is willing to listen. And so then after this initial encounter, also his entourage catches up with the king, and then Venerable Mahinda quickly assesses whether the king is sort of has a quick mind by the question about the mango tree, and then he teaches him the shorter discourse on the simile of the elephant footprint, Majjhima Nikaya 27. Yes. This is so the discourse, just a very short summary. A Brahmin encounters another person and he asks him where he's coming from. And then the other person says he's coming from the Buddha. And then the Brahmin says, "Do you think he's wise?" And the other person says, who am I to assess the wisdom of the Samana Gautama, of the Buddha? Someone would have to have equal wisdom to gauge his wisdom himself. And then the Brahmin says, you're praising him, you're giving him a big praise. And then the other person says, who am I to praise the recluse Gautama, the Buddha? He's sort of praised by those who are praiseworthy. And then the Brahmin asks him, how did he get such confidence in the Buddha? And then he says that it's just like if some elephant hunter would go into the elephant forest and he would see a big footprint of an elephant, and then he would come to the conclusion there must be this big elephant there. And so similar, when he saw these 4 things with the Buddha, he had this confidence that the Buddha is awakened and the Dhamma is well taught and the Sangha practices correctly. And so he saw various clever Khatyas and people from all castes and recluses going to the Buddha, and they sort of made up some questions and thought they can refute his teaching and went to the Buddha. And then But then when they come to meet him, then he gives them a teaching about the Dhamma, and then they actually never ask him this question anyway, and they are inspired and become his disciples. And so when he saw that, when he observed that, then he felt this strong confidence in the Buddha. And so then the Brahmin is very inspired and wants to go to see the Buddha himself. And then he goes to the Buddha and tells him this story. And then the Buddha says, in this way, the simile of the elephant's footprint is not complete yet, so I will tell you now the complete simile. And these elephant hunters, they would actually, at that time, some professionals would sort of try to catch elephants for them to get trained and used as a as a riding animal, and then train them. So anyway, so the elephant hunter goes into the forest, and then just because he sees the elephant footprint, he doesn't come to the conclusion that this must be a big bull elephant, but it might be also just a smaller, a young calf or some female elephant. And so he's searching further, and then he sees further marks of these elephants, maybe some sort of marks on the trees and so on, and he goes further, and then finally he encounters this elephant and sees the elephant himself. And then he knows there is this bull elephant, it's really there. And so similar, someone first gains sort of confidence in the teaching of the Buddha, he says, and then gradually practices the teaching of the Buddha and applies it and realizes it on a higher and higher level until complete liberation. And then, so first, when he just has his first experiences from the practice, he doesn't come to the conclusion that the Buddha is awakened, but only then once he has realized awakening himself. And so he follows these footprints, these things that the Buddha explains up to the last, when he sees the elephant himself, more or less. He sees he realizes the teaching himself. Yeah, and so that is more or less encouraging this mind of inquiry. That one applies the teaching of the Buddha and then realizes these things that the Buddha describes in his teaching further and further. And because of that, one comes to the conclusion that the Buddha is really awakened, and this Dhamma is well taught, and the Sangha is practicing for awakening. And so the king is inspired by the discourse, and he and the entourage take refuge. Interestingly, there's never an attainment reported of King Devanampiya in the whole Mahavamsa. So while other people, there are various attainments reported, even though he was a big supporter of the teaching of the Buddha in Sri Lanka. Why exactly, I'm not sure. In the Mahavamsa, I think it's said that he sort of is becoming a disciple of a future Buddha. Whether this is true, I'm not sure, obviously. So at least in the Mahavamsa itself, it's no mention that he ever becomes stream enterer or any attainment. So then it's already evening, and also see sort of how it's just these sort of little details where they sort of encounter each other and sort of these things that would normally happen. So the king invites them for dinner, and but then they tell him that they only eat next morning, and also the king invites them to stay in the city. And then they say, they actually don't want to stay in the city, they want to stay in the forest, they don't want to live there. And they just tell him that they come then the next day to the city. And in the evening, the layperson, Bhanuka, who is going with them, or came with them, he also then talks with the king, sort of explaining with them. He seems more of normal to the king, he's not one of these strange robed figures. So he the king somehow feels less apprehensive to talk with them and with him, and then so he's also talking with the king, and then afterwards after the king leaves, then Bhanuka gets ordained as the first monk in Sri Lanka. Then in the evening, Venerable Mahinda tells the Samanera Sumana to announce that the time for listening to the Dhamma has come and invite the Devas for listening to the Dhamma. And so, the Samanera then asks, how far should I make myself heard? And the Mahinda says, as far as whole Sri Lanka. And so the little Samanera flies on top of this rock spire and invites the Devas to listen to the Dhamma and makes the announcement that now the time has come to listen to the Dhamma. The king also hears of this chanting of the Samanera and sends some messenger sort of worrying whether maybe something bad has happened to them. But they tell the messenger, no, it's just that this was the announcement for the time to listen to the Dhamma. And so also some Devas come to listen to some Dhamma discourse of Aunt Mahinda. On the next day when they enter the city, so the king is also very respectful. He carries the alms bowl of Venerable Mahinda for the food offering, and also these other sort of little everyday details. So they're wondering whether would they sit on chairs or not. They put out some mats. And then after the food offering, he's first teaching the Queen Anula, the wife of the brother of the king of Sri Lanka, and the women living in the palace, and they become the first noble disciples, in Sri Lanka. Yes, the whole group. Yes. And so the arrival of the monks attracts larger and larger crowds who want to see them and listen to them because they hear of them. Also, at that time, obviously, probably, let's say, some arrival from some different country also attracts more attention, naturally, but also because of the Dhamma interest. And so, first, they then from this pavilion there, they then rededicate the elephant stables as a teaching venue because it's a larger hall. And then, once that is also too small, they move to a royal park close to the city for Dhamma teachings. In the evening, Venerable Mahinda and the monks, they want to go back to the mountain because the park is too close. So the king invites them. The king invites them to stay in another park, which is further away from the city. It's called the Mahamega Vana, which is then later gets called the Mahavihara, the Great Monastery. And so then, after they stayed the night there, the king asks them whether this would be a good location for the monks to stay. And Venerable Mahinda says it's a nice place. And so then the king offers this park as the first Sri Lankan monastery to the Sangha. And he also gives instructions about construction, what kind of halls to build where, say eating hall or some opposite hall, and these things. And the first Sima for where ordinations take place. And after further Dhamma teachings, on the second day, Queen Anula and the women already want to ordain. So they are, in this case, the women are the first who are interested to ordain in Sri Lanka. And Venerable Mahinda suggests to send a messenger to King Ashoka and to ask him to send his daughter, one of his daughters, Sangamita, became a nun, for establishing the nuns' order in Sri Lanka. And also suggesting to send a branch of the Bodhi tree from Bodhgaya, where the Buddha attained awakening, to Sri Lanka, so it can get planted in the monastery. And Venerable Mahinda continues to live and teach there in the Mahamega Vana for a week. According to the Mahavamsa, then at that time already 8,500 Sri Lankans take refuge in the Triple Gem. Then several months later, actually 1 month later, it's just exactly 1 month, the Vasa is the month afterwards, then the monks decide to go back to Mihintale, further away, 11 kilometers away from the city. And so the king comes after them, and then after he explains that he wants to stay there in this more secluded location, the king gets workers to prepare caves for them, and then the nephew of the king and the first 60 Sri Lankan monks get ordained on that occasion before the first Vasa, and they spend the first Vasa then in these caves. As I said, it's a very nice natural site where they actually have these caves, and so it's a nice place. Especially then at that time, obviously now it's a big pilgrimage site. So it's now it's more people are there, but then at that time it was just a place in the forest in nature. So I know, yeah, sure, yeah. Yeah, sure. I also visited. Yeah. Yeah, I will tell them then afterwards. Yeah. Yeah, and after the first Vasa, then also Venerable Mahinda suggests that Samanera Sumana requests some relics from King Ashoka to build the first stupa in Sri Lanka, which is then called the Tuparama, which gets built at this location where the monks entered the city of Anuradhapura the first time. And then, as suggested previously, the nephew of the king of Sri Lanka travels to King Ashoka, and he tells him about the success of his mission to Sri Lanka, and the Sri Lankans show great interest in the Dhamma. Then King Ashoka agrees to send his daughter Sanghamitta to establish the nuns community and to send the branch of the Bodhi tree. And so the southern branch of the Bodhi tree is then placed in a golden vessel by King Ashoka. And King Ashoka also honors the Bodhi tree 3 times before he sends it to Sri Lanka by bestowing the kingship to the Bodhi tree. And he also encourages the King of Sri Lanka to do the same, to honor the Bodhi tree in this way. And there's an iconic painting of the ship with Sanghamitta and the Bodhi tree arriving in Sri Lanka. It's a very nice painting. And then see them sort of arriving on the ship, and the king of Sri Lanka is wading into the water up to his neck to receive the Bodhi tree full of joy that arrives in Sri Lanka. So very nice painting and sort of capturing the occasion. I think it's in some monastery, but it's at least relatively famous. I saw it in several places. And then the Bodhi tree gets paraded through Anuradhapura and then planted in the Mahavihara, the first monastery in Sri Lanka. This is just a very short summary. In the Mahavamsa, the arrival of Venerable Mahinda and the building of the first stupa and the arrival of the Bodhi tree. This is sort of presented as the most important events in the history of Sri Lanka. So it's really like a big occasion how the king, how he even one whole chapter, the acquisition of the great Bodhi tree, like how King Ashoka then decides to basically get the southern branch of the Bodhi tree, and then they honor it, and then they send it, and it's a big event, and then the Bodhi tree arriving in Sri Lanka, the same. So it's more or less that is celebrated as very big occasions. In a way it's also correct, because in the sense the arrival of the Dhamma in a country is the most important event in history. So the Buddha also says that an eon, when the Buddha arises, is called a fortunate eon by the Buddha. So in the sense that, what is important, what happens in an eon, is actually whether Buddha arises or not. And the other historic events are only of very minor significance in comparison to that, in the larger picture. So this was the monumental beginning of the dispensation of the Buddha in Sri Lanka. And so in the centuries afterwards, it also continued to grow. Then Anuradhapura was surrounded by several monasteries, by the Mahavihara, the Jetavana monastery, the Abhayagiri monastery, and several small ones. And so several thousand monks living there around the capital. And then also the great stupa, the Ovan Vajirasana stupa, built 100 years later, which is 90 meters high. And so, it's... I'm not sure which one is the biggest. There might be some bigger ones, but it's certainly the ones which, is one of the most ancient stupa that has survived from that time.
That's the one that has the most Buddha relics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure, it can be, because then at that time from King Ashoka, that he sent many.
And if I can add, when King Ashoka sent the Bodhi with Sanghamitra, he sent some 3 doctors to look after the Bodhi, and one of the 3 doctors was living in Brisbane, one Guru descendants, and she was married to Nihal Gurutilaka, who was the editor for this temple for several years. He was honorary editor, and he didn't charge any money for years and years.
Yeah, there is in the Mahavamsa, when the Bodhi tree gets sent to Sri Lanka, then King Ashoka sends several families as of protectors of the Bodhi tree or something like that along. And then I'm not sure whether sort of these descendants still know whether from these families from that time, some distant descendants, but yeah.
I met them when I went to Sri Lanka. I met one of the chiefs, and they were carrying out some decorations to Sri Mahabodhi. And I got chatting to him. He said, I'm not Sri Lankan, I'm Indian. The village, the whole gang of people who came to look after the Bodhi tree.
After 2,300 years, they still think they're Indians, the descendants. So it's a little bit, but they don't really assimilate it well. But it's, in this sense, they kept the culture and their sort of their history in terms of being this custodians or not custodians or these carers for the Bodhi tree alive.
Carvers from India, even now. There's a big Buddha statue, upright Buddha statue, and for that they brought from India the carvers, because they're ancient.
For carving, yeah, sure. Yeah, they had probably more skill for doing this stonemasons. Maybe they were better professionals. Yeah. Yeah, so if you ever visit Sri Lanka, you can still see Mihintale and the Arathanagala, where Mahinda and the monks landed, and where then not far from it, the stupa, which marks the place where when Mahinda met the king of Sri Lanka, and also these caves where the first Sri Lankan monks stayed for the first Vasa. And in Anuradhapura you can see the Tuparama, the first stupa built in Sri Lanka. And of course also the southern branch of the King Ashoka's Bodhi tree, which is still growing in Sri Lanka and is now the oldest tree planted by humans in the world. So that's also still there. Some great historic monuments there. Yeah. Yeah, so maybe at the end some Dhammapada verses that came to our minds regarding sort of King Ashoka. And so I could say there are many kings and emperors in history who are called the Great, even though they often actually didn't do anything that great, but rather sort of horrible things. And so maybe the reason why King Ashoka can be called the Great is not because he established a large empire the size of India, but because he achieved a different kind of victory. And so the Buddha talks about that in his Dhammapada verses, Dhammapada verse 103 to 105. Though someone may conquer 1,000,000 men in battle, yet he is indeed the greatest victor who conquers himself. The victory over oneself is far better than the conquest of others. No god or angel, Mara or Brahma, can turn into defeat the victory of a person who has tamed himself, who is always restrained in conduct. And so was it this victory over oneself? If you abandon unwholesome tendencies or defilements that are difficult to overcome, there would be a victory over yourself. Or if you do something good that is difficult to do, then also it would be sort of victory over yourself. So by abandoning his conquest, ambitions, and violence, and make King Ashoka then made this effort to practice the teaching of the Buddha, and so this was his greatest victory. Not that he established a great empire, or usually these other kings are called the Great because they conquer great empire. Usually that's why they're called like this. And also English writer H.G. Wells, he says, amidst the tens of thousands of names of monarchs that are on the columns of history, the name of Ashoka shines and shines, almost alone, like a star. And so also that is a sort of quote that sort of reminds me of a Dhammapada verse. One who lived negligent and then is negligent no more, illuminates the world like the moon free from clouds. Who checks the evil actions he did by doing good actions instead, illuminates the world like the moon free from clouds. So in this sense, then if someone abandons his unwholesome conduct or harming other beings and then does good actions instead, he becomes an illuminator of the world, or someone who benefits others. And so, apart from this greatest victory of King Ashoka, this internal victory, his most long-lasting achievement was the success of his Dhamma-Missions. And then the Mauryan Empire declined in the centuries after King Ashoka passed away, but his Dhamma conquest was very successful, and it had effects up to the present day, more than 2,000 years later. And so it's also inspiring to remember, because as I said, we are living more or less in a similar era, like 250 BC, in the sense that at that time the teaching of the Buddha got established in faraway countries, and now as well. So that in Australia or United States or Europe or South America. And so in a way it's a similar era in history where the teaching of the Buddha and the monastic Sangha then get established in different countries. And so there are different factors that lead to the success. I think at that time, the time of King Ashoka, obviously one important factor is that people who teach the Dhamma actually have realized it. That's obviously is ideal. Like if actually people have ideally even realize it on the highest level. And the Buddha says that one of the conditions that the monastic order can continue is that the monks themselves are trained in virtue, samadhi, and wisdom, and then they can train others in these qualities as well. So more or less, that there are people who have realized the Dhamma and are willing to teach and train others with. And it's more or less the root cause for this continuation of practice and realization of the Dhamma. And so that is, I think, more or less the central factor that is to happen. That's then hopefully at least some people who have realized the Dhamma teach, and then some other people practice it and realize it as well. So yeah, and this it is more or less, it is, as I said, this effort lasted for a long time. So I don't know who started this rumor that the teaching of the Buddha will last only for 5,000 years. But someone have started this rumor. The Buddha himself actually says something else. And at the final Nibbana, then he makes this actually a different prediction, you could say. He says, if the monks dwell rightly, the world will not be empty of arahants. So as long as the monks practice correctly, there will be arahants in the world. And so the teaching of the Buddha can last for many hundred thousands of years, or it can already disappear in just a few centuries. There's no sort of guarantee. It just depends on the actions of people, to what extent the people respect the Triple Gem and are interested to practice and apply it, and practice these things that the Buddha taught, like the Noble Eightfold Path, the 7 enlightenment factors. And then there will be also people who realize it as lay people and monastics. And so, how long the teaching of the Buddha lasts and to what extent it will flourish in Australia or United States or Europe depends on our own actions. And so, as Buddhism gets established in Australia and other Western countries, then what we do can also have similar effects for millennia, just like when Buddhism came to Sri Lanka. And so one can make a smaller or larger contribution to that by practicing the Dhamma and following the teaching of the Buddha. Or just as a last short reading of King Ashoka, I finish with one of his short quote of his edicts. Concerning this, King Piyadasi speaks thus: wherever there are stone pillars and stone slabs, there this Dhamma edict is to be engraved so that it may endure long. It has been engraved so that it may endure as long as the sun and the moon shine, and so that people may practice it as instructed. For by practicing it, happiness will be attained in this life and the next. So, it's a very nice aspiration that the Dhamma may endure as long as the sun and the moon shine. Very sort of beautiful, poetic, even though it's sort of engraved on pillars and stones and monuments.